My name is Steffann, but I'm not here just on behalf of myself, but also on behalf of the whole team. So these are the people who have worked on this series of RIPE documents. So what are we talking about? What is this document? So it's a guidance document for what to ask for if you're buying IPv6 capable equipment. Because especially when this was written, but it still happens, you ask a vendor like, oh, does it support IPv6? And they're like, yes, it supports IPv6. See, there's one checkbox here that mentions IPv6, so it's mentioned somewhere, so it supports it. But it doesn't say anything about whether it's actually usable. So this is a document that helps you when you're, especially for enterprise, for big organizations, when you are procuring equipment. So this is what you would put in your tender, and it's meant as a template. So take the document, see what applies to you, what doesn't apply to you, and then use that as the basis for your purchase orders. However, what we also see is basically nobody actually does that, and most people just say, oh, equipment has to comply with RIPE 554. So that works as well. This document is written by the RIPE IPv6 working group. So even though we are the authors and we started it, this is not our document. We are just the shepherds of it. And actually the decisions on what goes in and what doesn't and what changes to make are all made in the RIPE IPv6 working group. It was quite successful. We actually had governments translate it into the local language and just include it in the purchasing manuals for the government themselves. We had companies that rely on this. We even had one vendor, I won't name them, but at some point we were talking to them and we're like, so, you know, what's your roadmap for IPv6? What are you planning to do? And they looked at us like, why are you asking us? You wrote the thing. Because what was in RIPE 554 was what big enterprises were demanding, so that was their development roadmap. So a document like this actually has quite some power. So how did this all start? Well, in Slovenia, a good friend of mine, Jan George, was pushing the government to require IPv6 when buying new services and equipment. So they're like, yeah, but what does that mean, require IPv6? What should we actually ask for? And at that point, you know, like, yeah, what do you ask for? Like, there's a whole list of RFCs, and since, you know, this is the internet, the list of RFCs is basically the list of requirements. So Jan made a list in Slovenian about what the government should ask for from their vendors. So we were sitting in a RIPE meeting, and Jan was sitting next to me. We're just chatting, and he's like, "Hey, by the way, I got this list. Do you think this would be useful for more people?" And I looked at it and was like, "This is brilliant. We need this." But yeah, the document was in Slovenian, so we put it in Google Translate, and then actually translated it after that. So we took the Slovenian document, we translated it into English, cleaned it up a little bit, and that's what became RIPE 501, the original version of this document. So posted to the mailing list, hey, we have a good idea, look at this document, is this useful? And then 2 months later, we had a RIPE policy, or policy RIPE document. It's not a policy document. So, you know, easy. But then the questions came in, like, why did you choose this? Why didn't you choose that? What about this? What about that? So because, yeah, for 501 we could just say like, oh, it's just a translation of the Slovenian version. We're not actually touching the content. It's just informational. But then, you know, it became a community thing, and we actually started interacting with the community to try to make it something that was that had a very broad consensus and actually had been discussed. Yeah. Like I said, I skipped this bit. So yeah, it might be superseded by a new version, and that's exactly what happened. So, beginning of 2011, we started working on the successor to RIPE 501. So, like I said, it was a translation of the Slovenian document. We started actually discussing it. This is a list of the this is copy-pasted from the RIPE document of all the contributors who actually helped improve it. So as you can see, that's quite a list. So we started in January. January 2011 we started. In June 2012, the revised document was finally ready. So we basically spent a year and a half processing all the updates. We completely changed the document, made several sections like focused on, okay, what should a host do? What should a switch do? What should a router do? Even switches are like, do we need enterprise grade or just, you know, consumer grade? So after this, we were really happy with the new document, RIPE 554. But yeah, at that point, we were also a bit tired of it. We spent a long time working on it. It was very hard to get consensus. So, yeah. Oh yeah, this is the main.
Good afternoon, everyone.
Hello. Good afternoon to you too. So yeah, like I said, we had lots of sections, consumer grade, enterprise grade, routers, security equipment, CPEs, everything. We made it became a very extensive document. And then, like I said, we were discussing, okay, but at some point we should update it again. Because RFCs get updated, or there are new RFCs that might be relevant. But yeah, 554 was like the famous number now. So we didn't really want to replace it with a document with a new number. And it was a lot of work. So we were quite hesitant to start working on a new version. And that's why it's taken so long. So finally this year, we decided to do it. Like, okay, this document is now almost a decade old. It's time to update it. So we gathered the courage. And then we're like, hey, what are we going to do? Are we going to expand the categories, go into more detail? I know actually in Germany they used RIPE 554, but they were like, oh, it's not accurate enough. So instead of just listing the RFCs, they actually listed the RFCs with each may and should specified whether they required this bit or not. So, you know, you can go into a lot of detail with this. In the end, we, basically for our own sanity, we chose to just keep it simple. Do basic updates, bring it to the current level of RFCs, like replace the old numbers, add the things that have been, the sensible things that have been developed, but not change too much, because otherwise we were afraid that it's going to take another year and a half before we have a new version. So that's where we are now. Of course, the basic things, you proofread a document a dozen times, and 5 seconds after you publish it, you spot a big error. That's just how it works. So we fixed those, we changed the references, we added fundamental RFCs like IPv6 over Ethernet. Like, it's basically a no-brainer that it should be there, but it wasn't actually mentioned anywhere. So we just added that. Things like send, secure neighbor discovery. There were some implementations, but it wasn't used anywhere. I think Cisco's could actually do it, but like Windows and Linux couldn't actually work with it, so it was pretty pointless. So we removed those. We had some references to the Bound v6 project. That doesn't exist anymore, so we cleaned that up. And in the next slides, I'll take you through the highlights of the things that we did change. So some things got, especially security related, have been tuned the last couple of years. For example, there's an RFC about how to handle overlapping fragments consistently. There's a RFC that specifies that atomic fragments, so IPv6 packets that have a fragmentation header but actually don't have multiple fragments, which is not very sensible, are now considered harmful. But yeah, when we wrote the original, the RIPE 554, atomic fragments were actually mandatory for some protocols. So, you know, new insights have developed over the decade, so we adapted to that. Also, back in those days, IPv6 addresses were just generated from the MAC address of your Ethernet interface. By now, people realized that this might not be a good idea, so we added the RFCs that actually specify the privacy interface IDs. Of course, the privacy interface IDs changed too much and became unpredictable, so now there's a standard for stable privacy IDs. We made things like DNS options in the router advertisement mandatory, and we made mobile IPv6 optional. Mobile IPv6 also isn't used very much these days, so we just didn't feel it belonged in the mandatory category anymore. The consumer switches, basically nothing changed. Those don't have any fancy features, so but for the enterprise switches, a lot of enterprises desperately want DHCP v6. Won't go into the details whether that's a good idea or a bad idea, but I've done consultancy for banks, and they're like, yes, we know we can do without it, but we have these very strict policies, and we just want to have this fine-grained control over our network. So we want DHCP v6. Okay, so we actually looked at that, and in many places, like if you look, for example, at Android, Android religiously refuses to implement DHCP v6. So we didn't want to make it mandatory for everything, but in an enterprise environment, you at least want to have the options to manage DHCP traffic. Even if you're not using it, you still want the option to block it, so nobody else starts talking DHCP v6 on your network and things like that. So here we actually added some DHCP v6 options because we think that enterprises will need these. It's a bit controversial, but I think we can make a good case that this is true for the majority of enterprises environments. Routers. Yeah, the basic things, the DNS options in the router advertisement. There's an RFC that basically says don't assume /64s because there's some equipment that gets very inefficient if your route is longer than a /64. And that can, for example, cause problems if you number point-to-point links with a /120 or 126 or 127. So, and again, also for these devices, there are some DHCP options that people might want. It's actually funny, the DHCP v6 originally said, oh, we're not going to look at MAC addresses anymore because that's bound to an interface. We're actually going to look to the device ID because then we can distinguish which device it is, not depending on which interface it uses to get to the network. Of course, because IPv4, everything is based on MAC addresses, this created a big split where IPv4 was managed by MAC address and IPv6 was managed by DUID, and there was no correlation between the two, which made it actually harder. So, for example, some of the options are that the MAC address is actually included in the DHCP request so that the policy system can actually determine who's who. So again, some of those things seemed like a good idea at the time, but in the end it turned out that maybe sticking to those old MAC addresses wasn't so bad after all. So we didn't make those mandatory, but we added them as optional extra features that people might want. CPEs, consumer equipment. We just added the RFC that specifies the simple security capabilities that these devices need to have. Funnily enough, 10 years ago, there was no single RFC that actually specified minimal security requirements. So we thought it was a good idea to include those at this point. And then the biggest change, mobile devices. Originally, when we wrote RIPE 554, there was actually some interaction with the 3GPP crowd on what a mobile device should do on its cellular interface. It turned out after this decade, we actually don't know anymore, and we didn't have any connection with that community anymore. And we realized that maybe we weren't the right community to specify what a mobile device should do. So we decided to just get rid of the whole section. Now we treat mobile devices, if they have a Wi-Fi interface, they just behave like a normal host on the Wi-Fi interface. And the 3GPP-based standards for the cellular interface, those are not made in RIPE. Those are not, like the RIPE community has very little influence there. So we just decided to not include them in this document and leave that to other forums to specify that. Load balancers, very simple change. 10 years ago, everybody used the X forwarded 4 header. These days, there's an RFC that actually specifies a standard header with the same purpose, which is a bit more flexible. So we changed that. And then software. This is actually an interesting one. We didn't say much about software in RIPE 554, but this is a major pain point for a lot of enterprises. So we, instead of having some very vague requirements like, the software should work with IPv6 just like it does with IPv4, the user shouldn't really notice the difference, we actually put in some stronger requirements like all valid addresses must be accepted on input, the output must follow the recommended notation, DNS resolving must be implemented, connection sockets must be used. It's recommended to use Happy Eyeballs or Happy Eyeballs 2. And we made it explicit that this is not an exhaustive list, but these are really the minimum requirements that people should expect from software these days. So, I don't know, maybe we need to make this even stronger. And then we get to this point. It's still under discussion. This document isn't finished yet. It's still we still call it RIPE 554 bis because the moment it gets consensus, it will get a new number. Until then, we just call it bis, and it's still under active discussion. So I would like to ask you, take a look at this document, and if you have any input and suggestions, questions, please let us know, because this is a community document. This is what we think that enterprises and governments and organizations like that need from their equipment in these times. And like I said, it's very important because what is in this document will appear on the roadmaps of the major vendors, because there's a lot of uptake on these documents. RIPE 554 has been translated into a dozen languages. It's used all over the world and actually became like the standard to what to ask for. So we really want to get this right, because things that end up in the successor to RIPE 554 will very likely be implemented by all the vendors. So this might actually influence the direction that the IPv6 deployments in enterprises go. We have the document is a live document. It's on Google Docs, so you can see what's happening there. Go to the mailing list, ask questions, email us directly. We are looking to get consensus on this document at the RIPE 83, which is next week. So end of next week, it might be that we don't get consensus, and then we'll have to continue. But yeah, if you have any input, please let us know this week or the beginning of next week so we can actually implement it and use it. Sorry for the pressure. And that's it. Does anybody have any questions? Eggs, rotten tomatoes.
If anyone in the room does have questions, please come up to the microphone here. We have a question from the webcast.
Somebody asks, is there a plan to update the document on a regular schedule so organizations using it in their purchasing processes can always specify something fairly recent? Hopefully that would mean smaller updates, making the process somewhat easier.
Yeah, that's a thing that's been asked before, and yeah, we are a bit ashamed that it took us a decade to actually update the document. It also is influenced a little bit by how RIPE works, because RIPE documents, every new version gets a new number. So it's very hard to have one number you can refer to. We actually did talk about having like a live document that gets updated over time. But then you get the problem if somebody says it has to conform to RIPE X, that a person reading the same document a week later might get different content. So we do need stable identifiers, but having a completely different number every X months or years is also a bit difficult. So we tried to find the middle ground. This way we definitely were too slow with updating it. So we will try to do it more regularly, but yeah, I also want to be careful with updating it too often, because then for enterprises a moving target is usually inconvenient. So yeah, sorry I can't give a more direct answer to that.
Hi, Greg Choules, currently ISC, formerly 3 Mobile in the UK. So the thing that you said about removing the section about mobiles completely because you just didn't have the expertise. The GSMA are quite approachable, you know, if you talk to them nicely, and, you know, having come from a mobile background where we did use V6 quite heavily, I think it would be an important thing to include, as in, you know, how do you guys actually do this properly and be standards compliant?
So yeah, we had the feeling that forums like 3GPP were more authoritative in this field. Mm-hmm. So we felt it strange as a RIPE community to list requirements there. But maybe there's one single set of documents in 3GPP that we just can refer to.
Well, I think it's probably useful that, you know, the GSMA themselves, you know, at times probably need some expertise input to them so that they can go, okay, this is how we're going to, you know, make the standard correct for this community of mobile users. You know, there are some things that you look at in GSMA and you think, yeah, you know, I wish you'd done that a bit better. You know, you'd had some more informed stuff, you know, back in the past. But, you know, so I think it's probably beneficial if something tries to happen there, because, you know, the world is full of handsets.
Yeah, it's the majority of devices these days.
Indeed, yeah.
Yeah, thank you. So yeah, I'll take that back to the other authors, and we'll see what we can do with that, whether in this document or in some other way. But yeah, if you say that they can use some cooperation, I'm sure we can find a way to do that. Thank you.
Any other questions? Thank you very much, Simon.
There's a number of questions in the Mattermost channel.
Oh, we missed some questions in Mattermost.
I I don't see. I see one from. I don't know how to pronounce the actual username. Livagoria. I'll try that with, but I don't see any other. What are you seeing, Keith?
That sounds like Leo Vigoda.
Probably. I apologize for the butchering of the name. Okay.
Keith, can you see? Do you have the question? I'll repeat it.
Okay, question from Leo Pagoda. Is there a plan to update the document on a regular schedule? So we're going to...
Yeah, we just had that one. Okay, no worries. But yeah, it's a difficult subject. I'll have a chat with Leo.
If that's it, thank you very much.
Thank you.